From VQR and the Center for Media and Citizenship, this is episode 5 of Circle of Willis, where neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett and I talk about the nature of human emotion and how misunderstanding emotion may be more consequential than you think. Hey everyone, it's Jim Cohn and this is my podcast, Circle of Willis. This episode features a conversation with Lisa Feldman Barrett, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University, where she's also a professor of neuroscience in the departments of radiology and psychiatry. I started making a list here of her various fellowships and awards, and you know, there's a lot of them, so I kind of gave up. Just believe me. Now, this one is at the top of her game. Lisa is really one of the world's leading theorists of emotion now, of what emotions are. And her answers are likely to surprise you a lot. Lisa's work is rooted primarily in psychology and neuroscience, but it borrows liberally from anthropology, behavioral ecology, linguistics, philosophy, and on and on. It's so compelling and fresh that it's been prominently featured along with Lisa herself pretty much all through season 3 of that super popular NPR podcast, Invisibilia, which is all about the invisible forces that control human behavior, and which is just amazingly excellent and very highly recommended by me. So anyway, Lisa and I spoke in Boston shortly after her recent book came out. And so we talk all about it in this recorded conversation. This book, Lisa's book, is called How Emotions Are Made: The Secret Life of the Brain. And I'm just going to say it. I think you should go and buy it, like right now, and read it. Look, I'm not getting any money for that. There's no secondary gain for me if you purchase Lisa's book. I just love it is all. And I want to share it with my fellow persons of the world. Lisa's book has got everything. It's got a compelling topic, human emotion. It's got a contemporary frame that brings the latest neuroscientific evidence to bear, as well as the latest theoretical views on questions like, what is a brain even for? How do brains even work? Why should any of this matter to us? But Lisa, being Lisa, she takes it even further. She gets into why psychologists and neuroscientists might have gotten these questions wrong for so long. And that puts the science into a cultural and historical perspective, that's interesting. I mean, I don't want to alarm anybody, but science is, after all, a human activity conducted by people. And people do the things that people do, including sometimes favoring strongly held beliefs, even in the face of conflicting evidence. And that, friends, is one of the many reasons that science is so frickin' hard. It can freak you out when the data start telling you something different than what you expect, And Lisa's take on how emotions are made, on what emotions are, let's just say that it isn't intuitive for most of us. But once it clicks, once you get it, it veers pretty quickly into mind-blowing territory. I first encountered Lisa's work shortly after starting graduate school in the mid-1990s. I remember these articles she was writing at the time, challenging in the most uncompromising tones the idea that there were these 5 core sort of basic emotions that were what we call human universals, which is to say that were shared by all humans in all cultures around the world, that they were in fact independent of culture by virtue of being part of our biological constitution. These emotions were, they were fear, sadness, joy, anger, that's 4, and disgust. And these basic emotions came with basic emotional facial expressions, stereotypical facial expressions that were more or less understandable by all humans everywhere, by virtue of our innate biology. So, Lisa is what we sometimes call detail-oriented. She's a bit of a stickler for, the internal consistency of an empirical argument. And in her survey of the literature on emotion, she started to realize that the dominant theories, this theory especially of these sort of basic human universal emotions, just didn't really fit well with the data that people were reporting. And anyway, we get into all that in our conversation, and really Lisa is much better at talking about it than I am. But I do want to say this. The topic of emotion really goes to just about the core of what it is to experience a human life. So, this stuff matters. Emotion is essential for our survival, for creating our social worlds, for navigating our often uncertain and demanding life circumstances. But emotion is also largely what our subjective experience is made of in this one life that any of us is ever going to have. And the topic of emotion raises all kinds of other questions, which is why along the way, Lisa and I talk about things like how the brain is designed to predict our moment-to-moment experiences, how our subjective perception is really a blend of these predictions and the feedback we get from our environments. Why all of us have to manage our body's metabolic resources like little economists, and more, all kinds of stuff, heady stuff. But Lisa Feldman Barrett is here to help us all figure it out, to guide us sort of gently down the counterintuitive path, as it were. So open your minds, people, because here it comes. So I'm conflicted in terms of what I want to talk about, because, I've got Lisa Feldman Barrett in the room, and I want to talk about everything that you do. And I want to talk about your career. I think there's real pedagogical value in learning how you sort of grew up. But I think the place to start really is to just ask you about this book that's come out. Mm-hmm. So tell me about the book.
Well, a number of times over the last 10 years or so, I've been approached to write a popular book, which I swore I would never do.
Right.
Because I'm just too, I was just too captivated with the science, and I didn't want to take time away. And then in 2013, there was a journalist who was writing a feature piece on me and my lab's work for Boston Magazine.
I remember that. Yeah.
She kept asking me, she was fantastic. She asked fantastic questions. She probably dug harder and read more of my scientific papers than my colleagues had, actually.
Yeah.
And one thing she kept saying is her editor kept pressing her, why is this important? So we have the wrong theory of emotion. Who cares? Like, why does it matter,
Yeah.
And so she kept coming back to me and saying, I really want to do this article, but it's only going to fly if you can tell me why it matters. And my first reaction was kind of a knee-jerk.
Eat shit. I don't want to tell you.
Yeah, my first reaction was, listen, do we require this of physicists who talk about, strings vibrating in 11 dimensions?
Right.
Do we require this of physicists who talk about the Higgs boson? This was before, the evidence that came out of the Hadron Collider, or, multiverses or any of this other stuff. No, we don't. No. We don't ask them to justify themselves. It's just interesting. Right. So it should be really interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
How is
God damn it.
What is the brain doing?
Yes.
And what's happening in the body during emotion? Why can't we just be interested for science sake?
Right.
But she really was persistent. And so I thought, all right, I'll grudgingly spend a couple of days thinking about it. And when I started to really think about it and do a little bit of reading, I realized actually people are really harmed in many spheres of life by using the wrong theory
of emotion.
In politics, in security, in mental health, in physical health. There are a number of examples that I give throughout the book, actually, where having the wrong ideas about how emotions work, what they are, how they work, leads people to make decisions that are really harmful, sometimes financially harmful, and sometimes harmful in terms of losing their lives.
Whoa. So can you give me some examples?
Yeah, sure. So one example is that when women present themselves in the emergency room with symptoms of what could be a heart attack, those symptoms are very similar to the symptoms that you experience during an anxiety attack.
Right.
And over
That's
the age of
classical example.
over the age of 65, more women die from heart attacks than men do. And one of the reasons why, it's not the only reason, one of the reasons why is that they are routinely sent home because they are misdiagnosed as having anxiety instead of having a full workup and detecting that there's actually a problem with the heart. The women themselves and and the emergency room doctors have a classical view of emotion, with the idea that there are very definitive fingerprints for things like anxiety and fear, and that these are somehow biologically separate and very distinguishable from physical symptoms of illness. And that, combined with the mistaken belief that women are more emotional than men, which is also an interesting part of the
Wait,
sort of...
they're not? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know you are.
I know.
Leads to people losing their lives. And before, there are a couple of times when I've been interviewed about this, interviewers will say, really? Come on, really? One of the publicists that I've worked on my book, this happened to her mother.
She was diagnosed with anxiety?
She went to an emergency room with symptoms of heart that were like there was an impending heart event about to occur, and she was sent home with anxiety, and she died.
Holy shit! You think commonly, if you ask lay people about the link, to the extent that lay people are going to know about the link between panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and heart attacks, they're going to say that the problem really is not what you're saying. The problem is that so many people think they're having a heart attack when they're really having an anxiety attack.
Sure, you can pick apart any single example that I'm giving you. Mm-hmm. The fact is, though, that what your body, the idea that there is an objective physical fingerprint for each emotion, and that somehow it is distinguishable in a biological sense from physical symptoms, is a myth. And
it's a myth.
It's a myth.
There are physiological fingerprints for an emotional state.
There is no evidence that there is a single fingerprint for anxiety,
that seems
for
like
fear,
an important qualifier.
Right. So, that is what the classical view rests upon, and that's what currently technology-related industries are spending billions of dollars trying to develop objective emotion reading technology.
AI.
A space doesn't speak for itself when it comes to emotion. The physical state of your body does not conform to a fingerprint that you can use to diagnose independently of all sorts of other information.
Right. So we want a device, or somebody wants a device that can say,
sure.
A physician wants a device that can say, when you come in and your fingertips are cold and your heart is racing, you're having anxiety.
Or marketers want a device where they can just look at your face or just take a couple of readings from your peripheral nervous system and then know how you feel. And the classical view has lent credibility to the notion that such fingerprints exist, but they don't. But I'll tell you, the one that really got me, the one that was for me the tipping point for writing this book, was actually the training of children diagnosed with autism to read emotion in facial movements.
Oh my gosh.
For me, that was the one.
That was the last straw.
That was the last straw. So there's all of this research that's being done with children who've been diagnosed with autism. So in autism, there are a number of difficulties that these children face, but one of the difficulties is they don't understand social signals. They have a hard time understanding what physical movements mean. So in a neurotypical brain of the sort that, probably you and I have.
Speak for yourself.
When we see physical movements, like right now, where our heads are moving, our facial muscles are moving, our body's movements are, we're leaning in or leaning back or what have you.
Right.
Our brains automatically guess at what the mental state is that corresponds to those
and we're
movements.
pretty good at it. We're pretty accurate.
Well, I wouldn't.
I would say. That accounts for the fluidity of conversation.
We're accurate
right?
enough, I would
accurate
say.
Enough.
Yeah, there's an optimal level of accuracy. If you think about accuracy as coordination between what's actually in your head and my guessing what's in your head,
Yeah.
and we can talk about that later. But so the idea, and it makes sense, right, that then one thing that you could do with these kids is train them to recognize a scowling face as a signal to anger, or a pouting face as a signal for sadness, and so on. And this is based on the assumption that each one of us has a diagnostic expression that we make when we are in an emotional state, and that everyone around the world makes these expressions, and that we can recognize them as easily as we can read words on a page. So all you have to do is teach kids to read these to recognize, identify these facial configurations, and because they're universal facial expressions. The problem, though, of course, is that these expressions were stipulated by Darwin. They're not the only set of stipulated expressions that have ever existed in the history of written.
They were stipulated by Darwin.
They were stipulated by.
What do you mean
he said these are the ones.
These are the ones.
These are the
ones.
ones.
The expression of emotion in man and animals.
Exactly. And then scientists, rather than doing very careful studies of how people actually move their faces in everyday life, they adopted these expressions because Darwin said so. And and we have and really what these faces are stereotypes, Western stereotypes for facial expressions of emotion. Because in the data that does exist from measuring people's facial muscle movements, facial EMG, and in a number of studies that observe people in everyday life, it becomes really clear that your face doesn't just conform to a scowl when you're angry. People do all kinds of things in anger, right? They cry in anger, they laugh in the face of anger, they might withdraw in anger, they might look away. They don't always scowl, and people scowl at times that have nothing to do with anger.
Yeah,
my husband,
know, it's true.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So
what does your husband do?
He scowls when he's concentrating.
Well, so do I.
Yeah.
Right.
So
do you ever do that?
Yeah, no, I do. Well, sure. I mean,
is this related to, what is it, resting bitch face?
Yes,
is that
it is exactly related to resting bitch.
It is?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's lucky.
Anyways, my point is that so you can train these kids, right, to recognize these faces.
Yeah.
And they work really hard to do it because it's hard for them. And they do it. They struggle and they do it. And as a parent of one of these kids, you might be thinking, this is going to really help my kid socially connect with me and with other people.
Because they're going to be able to read my face and respond appropriately.
And so you're full of hope.
They're going to hack it.
And you watch your kids struggle to learn these faces. And they do learn them.
Uh-huh.
And then it generalizes not at all to the real world. So it doesn't help at all in the real world. But think of yourself as one of these parents.
You've invested all this in this
Think about
theory.
Think about the disappointment that you would feel after watching your kid for months try to learn to recognize these faces and then realize that it hasn't helped them a bit. And then how would you feel? You would feel deflated. You would feel demoralized. You would feel tremendous disappointment. And then imagine learning that actually there's a tremendous amount of science out there which shows that this would never have worked in the first place. It shouldn't have worked in the first place. I would be beside myself, really. Yeah. And I thought, okay, I just had such empathy for parents, actually, of these kids that I just thought, well, you know what? I'm going to write a book and I'm going to put the evidence out there, and then people can decide for themselves what they think.
We've talked about a little bit of this stuff before, I mean, in many other contexts, and I've told you already that I sort of grew up in the tradition of the Darwin expressions, right? The Ekman stuff, working with Gottman and Levinson, and doing all of these kinds of things. I sort of grew up in that environment and started having a lot of the same kinds of misgivings that you have. I mean, I started reading your work, I think, in earnest in the late 90s, probably somewhere around there, because I was trying to sort of work out some of these observations for myself because I was learning about measurement theory and all these things. But the hardest part for me has always been the expressions. For some reason, I always get stuck on the expression. I definitely understand that the establishment of a sort of physiological fingerprint has not been successful. As I've become more of a neuroscientist and gone into that direction, we'll talk about that in a second as well. I want to talk about the brain and all of this. That's not been as successful as one might have hoped, although we all thought that the amygdala was the seat of fear for a long time.
Speak for yourself.
But the expression part, I still sometimes wonder if it's really a question of sensitivity and specificity, right? So if we ask the sensitivity question, are we going to catch all instances of anger, for example, with a scowl? But the problem then is specificity, right? So
I think it's sensitivity and specificity. So I would say, first of all, and let me just be really clear, am I saying that there's no meaning in facial movements? Of course I'm not saying that at all. I'm not in any way.
That's a relief.
I'm not in any way claiming anything like that. Well, but sometimes
But if I went to someplace
Well, we have gone
away.
to someplace far away.
Yeah?
We've gone.
And I'm going like this all the time, baring my teeth and scowling at people. They're going to not have any idea what I'm intending?
Correct. They
Really?
might think that you have to go to the bathroom.
Maybe I do.
I mean, we have sent expeditions to Tanzania to study the Hadza, who are the last hunter-gatherer culture that's been continuously hunting and gathering since the Pleistocene. So
Right.
They are the people who are studying them is really the best kind of population to study to evaluate the classical view of emotion, because according to many of those theories, basic emotion theory and evolutionary psychology theories of emotion, emotions and their expressions evolved in that context, in that cultural context. Mm-hmm. So those people should have done beautifully on the classic kind of paradigm that we use in psychology that people have developed.
Where you show pictures.
You show
and say,
pictures.
Tell a story
and
of the picture. Or...
Yeah, or you show, well, first what you do is you tell a story of an emotion, and then you show two faces or three faces, and you say pick the face.
Right.
And, or you, though that's the standard way to do it. And with more westernized cultures, you show a face and you give a set of words and you say pick the word that matches the face. And there's an interesting story there, I think, about the methods and what's going on in those methods. And because, the methods are really tied up with when you see evidence that supports universality and when you don't. But my point here is that even when you use those methods, unless you use a very specific manipulation check, that is a check on whether or not your subjects understand the Western cultural concept of anger. If you do that and you sort of teach, well, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. Let me just say it this way. When you show people those faces, you show people a scowling face and you say, how does this person feel? What's going on for this person? You don't see any evidence that people routinely see scowls as anger in the Hadza and also in the Himba, who are semi-pastoralists who live in rural Namibia, Western Namibia at the Congolese border. So, or Angola border, actually. I'm sorry. It's at the Angola border. So, no, you actually, it's not the case that all around the world people see a scowling face and they think that you're angry.
Do they ever pick something that we would typically consider like the opposite, like a smile? Are there degrees? Are there like sort of?
Well, sure. So let me just say this. First of all, there are some smiles that they do pick, yes.
Uh-huh.
But more routinely, what seems to be more universal anyways, is valence, is distinguishing a pleasant from an unpleasant expression, an expression that indicates that someone is feeling pleasure versus feeling distress. That's actually harder to disrupt, although it's very easy to confuse people when you start to give them context along with the faces.
Sure.
Right? But we're now here talking about...
Because they could be happy about a bad thing or unhappy about a good thing, or,
Well, I think the thing to consider here with these experiments is that you're presenting a face outside of any kind of context. And when this happens, a smile usually is indicative, not always, but most of the time, as something pleasant. And a scowl is usually indicative as something unpleasant. But when you add context so you place a face in context, you can make a smile look negative and you can make a scowl look positive.
How about that?
There's really nice evidence, actually.
So, in zooming out from based on what you've just said, sort of in there is at least the idea that there's a kind of a facial signature, if you will, for positivity and negativity.
I wouldn't go so far as to say there's a signature. I think a signature is really the wrong way to think about it. That's just, in my book, I talk a lot about essentialism, the idea that there's a one-to-one relationship, a signature for any kind of mental state. There's no signature. What there is, when you are happy or when you're angry or any other emotion, there is a variety of things that you feel, that you do with your face, that your brain is doing. Each emotion is a category of highly variable instances. Variability is the norm when it comes to emotion. So there are no signatures. That being said, it's very possible that if I measured you across many different situations in your life, I might discover that you have a vocabulary of 5 expressions that you make for anger, and maybe one for, depending on what the context is.
They could be more or less reliable in terms of indicating my inner state.
Sure. And maybe I have, 3, and maybe, your wife has 8, and maybe my husband has 7. And maybe there's some overlap because we're all North Americans and we've all grown up, relatively speaking, in the same culture. But even with people within the same culture, for example, think about your wife. Think about when you first met your wife. Think about how well you read her face, so to speak, when you first met her, and how well you read her face now. We do perceptual learning with people.
Sure.
We learn.
We get lots of feedback, lots of interaction.
Yeah, we have a lot of data to work with because we have a lot of interaction. And we usually, if we're close with the person, get some feedback about when we are correct and we are incorrect.
Right.
And so, of course, we have tells. Of course, my husband reads me extremely well.
Yeah.
Sometimes he is aware. He can predict that, for example, I suffer from migraine headaches. Oh. And he can usually predict when one's coming on before I even feel the aura of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's because I do actually take on a sort of a physical demeanor when this happens, because I'm starting to feel discomfort.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of it yet. I'm conscious of it. Obviously, I'm consciously feeling it, but I'm not quite aware of it yet. But he's become very sensitive to it. And there's one really funny story that I relay in my book about this. It's sort of heretical, actually, if you're a woman, to sort of say this. But, there was one a couple of years ago, I guess now 7 years ago, I was moving from one university to another, and I was moving my lab, which is a very complicated procedure, as you know.
Yeah.
And it's not just moving people and boxes, it's also moving hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and data, which has to be kept secure.
Right.
And so it's very serious. It's very serious and very challenging.
Yes.
And I was under a deadline I had 2 weeks to make this whole move. I was moving more than 20 people, all this stuff. And there was snag after snag after snag. I should say, things did go kind of relatively smoothly, but when those snags happened, they were really big snags, right? And there was
sorry.
Yeah, well, no, it was relative to other people's war stories. This is really not so bad. But my point is that, there was a lot going on. I kept my cool through every single one, just dealt with the problems. And then a really big snag hit on a Friday afternoon at 5:00. I had a grant deadline at 6 p.m. I was supposed to be going on vacation the next day with my family, who had been, incredibly patient with me.
Right.
And then at about 5:45, 5:50, it was 5:45, my computer died.
I would have shit my pants.
I basically sort of sank to the floor in tears, and I just sat down and I started to cry.
Oh, no.
My husband walked in
Lisa.
and he said, are you premenstrual? Well, I mean, I tore him a new one. I was like, how dare you? I just, I basically exploded at him. I was incensed.
Shit.
Okay.
Dumbass.
But I need
what
to
did he say that for?
That 3 days later, I got my period.
Wait
Unexpectedly.
What
right?
are you talking about?
I'm
really?
telling you, yeah. So no, he totally read it. He read it correctly.
Jesus.
He was able to use his 20-something years of experience of having been with me to know, right, that even
with all of that other stuff happening, I mean,
But with all of that other stuff happening, I don't normally
you don't
completely
normally
lose my
lose it quite that way.
No, I normally don't lose it.
It's so funny to hear, because my wife has this ability to tell kind of the nature of my upsetness when I'm upset. She knows whether it's something that she has to be really concerned about or whether it's because I didn't sleep very well last night.
So my husband is exactly the same way. But how did your wife learn that? How did my husband learn that? Through a lot of perceptual learning.
Hard-won experience.
Right. So each of us has a vocabulary, a repertoire,
Yeah.
Of what we feel in certain circumstances and also how we express what we feel in those circumstances. And our spouses learn that. And we learn that about our children and we learn that about each other.
Yeah.
And so all of that learning is what allows us to, very automatically and usually without tremendous effort, make guesses about, our brains are guessing about what each other are feeling and what we're going to do next without very much awareness or even consciousness on our part.
This is a really important idea. And I don't know if I just want to make sure that anyone listening can get the implications of this. This is important implications for policy, for AI development, for research. Because what you're really suggesting is that although there may not be these sort of broad normative patterns that we can rely on generalizably to everyone who walks through our door, there may be relatively fixed, reliable patterns within individuals across time.
But think about something really simple, like you're in a negotiation. Let's say you're in industry or you're in government and you're in a negotiation with someone who happens to nod their head when they mean no and shake their head when they mean yes.
Yeah.
That would be slightly problematic.
That would, until you got to know them, right? And then the
but think about the mistakes.
The ideographic
But think
story
about the mistakes.
comes to play.
Sure, but so there are two messages here. I think one is that, in my book I discuss how some fairly large and disastrous errors have been made by assuming that expressions of emotion are universal when they're not.
Right.
And second of all, the science really needs some person-specific observation over time, which you use the correct scientific term, which is
ideographic.
Right, ideographic. Yeah. And that one of my concerns about the technology wave of, emotion, the emotion
recognition gear for gamers and for law enforcement and for
is that
teachers.
What's going to happen is all of this money and this incredible ingenuity and innovation is going to be directed to trying to find these diagnostic facial expressions. And then when that, as evidence is continuing to come out that it doesn't work, they don't work to do that people will throw away all this technology instead of realizing that the real innovation here is the ability to be able to study people in context in their own lives over time. And that this would actually not only provide the marketers more with what they want and the security agencies more with what they want, but it would actually revolutionize the science.
Are you talking with Google yet? Can you say?
I can say that Google has thus far not contacted me and not responded.
Yeah.
I do get there are many companies that have contacted me.
Yeah.
And they're they usually take one of two tacks. One is they want to talk about what the science really looks like, not what the hype is, but what the science really looks like. Or they want to try to convince me that the hype, that the PR is really right. And my reaction, to the latter is knock yourself out, man. If you want to invest all of that money and time in trying to find those stereotypes in people's everyday lives. I'm not saying people never scowl in anger. Of course they do sometimes. The question is how often and how specifically.
Right.
And so, because, if you wanted to use it as an objective marker of anger, it better be pretty specific and it better be pretty frequent. Otherwise, you're screwed.
You know what it reminds me of a little bit is the AI technology on voice recognition dictation, right? So that technology to date, as far as I know, is what I've read about, isn't very good at just capturing anybody's voice.
No, you have to train it.
You have to train it with your own voice over time, and it learns to sort of recognize you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so everything, and the reason why is that even a sound like "buh," the acoustics of that sound very different if you say bear or bottle. Right? To us, the B sounds exactly the same in our awareness.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at the acoustical signature, it's different.
If you do a frequency band analysis.
Yeah, because the sound B is actually a heterogeneous category.
And that's so fascinating because part of then the way that we probably process it in our experience is contextual based on other sounds around it.
Your brain is built to be multimodal in its processing. You don't analyze acoustical signals separately from visual signals, separately from the sensory signals from your body, separate from olfaction and taste and so on. Your brain has systems for knitting those sensory signals together, and it's very hard actually to derive meaning just from a single sensory signal.
There's so many things. There are many things about what you're saying so far in our conversation that are so satisfying for me. But one of them is how much it sort of recapitulates patterns in other literatures within psychology. If you think, I'm reminded a little bit of the sort of Walter Mischel critique of personality, or of the way that perception is active, not passive.
Exactly.
All of these things start sort of piling on to each other.
I mean, even something like, I was talking to a vision scientist the other day, and he said, well, but, we do experiments all the time where we just show people, visual images and they process them independently of other sensory systems. And I said, first of all, no, they don't. That's not true. So he's like, yes, I do. We're just showing them, we just show them images.
Excuse me?
And I'm like, well, have you disconnected the brain from the rest of the body? Of course there are other modalities that are in play that you're just not measuring them. But people with eyes who are looking at a screen, which has stuff displayed on it, also have a body that is sending sensory information continuously throughout their whole lives. And, so no, even in a unimodal study, there is still multimodal information, even if you stuck headphones on them so they couldn't hear anything else, even if you plug their nose, so, there was no olfactory. I mean, there's still the whole body that's, connected, right? So that's the first point. And the second point is really careful studies show, I just think it's incredibly fascinating, that even in primary visual cortex, so this is the part of the cortex which is, where information from the sensory world, this is the first part of the cortex that receives information from the sensory world through, from
the whole homunculus.
So, you have light comes in through your retina, goes along the optic nerve, up through some subcortical way stations like the superior colliculus, the thalamus, to primary visual cortex. That structure carries information about auditory signals, and it carries information about somatosensory signals. Nobody's ever checked to see whether it carries information about sensations from the body, which we refer to as interoception. But there's pretty good, I would say, not specific evidence, but pretty good evidence that's consistent with that view. It hasn't been tested, I think.
Kind of in cuneal kind of activations, modulating all that.
There's actually a whole network that's responsible for integrating. But I'm talking about now the primary sensory regions carry information about the other senses. Yeah,
that's become something that's very interesting to us in our lab. It's super cool. But you also, we want to get back to the body a little bit, sort of embodied sort of understanding of the world, because that's a nice segue into another aspect that was, when I was first reading your work, was very confusing to me, because I had grown accustomed to a reading of William James that suggested to me that these emotional states that we experience should have a specific bodily signature. That I drew from William James as a sort of theoretical statement that said.
But let me ask you a question seriously.
Okay,
I'm asking you an honest question.
I'm going to give you an honest answer.
Did you actually read William
No,
James?
not until 2002 or 2003 or so. After I'd been, can I give you an extra honest answer? That's after I'd cited William James on this topic in some early papers. I mean, thinking about the idea of a neuroscience. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I in 2001 I published a facial feedback study that worked beautifully. By the way, it worked. I mean, beyond expectations, and we've replicated it several times. And drawing a little bit on William James, drawing obviously on Paul Ekman and.
Let me just say that facial feedback could still work with a Jamesian view. It's just the Jamesian view is somewhat different from what he actually wrote, as I'm sure you discovered.
Yeah. So what did I get wrong?
So let me just say that I have a whole chapter in my book where I talk about Darwin and how Darwin has been misquoted again and again and again from, the expression of the emotions in men and animals. I talk a little bit about William James. I could have written a whole book really about how great scientists have been misquoted. But here I only picked a couple, and I talked a little bit about how it could be that we could so misunderstand what these great scientists said. And James, I think, is a really interesting example because James has been quoted. In fact, many textbooks also describe William James as having said that there is one bodily pattern for each emotion, for anger, for sadness, for anger, for sadness, for fear.
You're experiencing the state of your body is what you're experiencing.
Yeah, so that your perception of your body is the experience of emotion, is emotion, and that there's one pattern for each emotion. But here's the thing. William James actually said that there's one bodily state for every instance of emotion that you feel. So when he said, he wasn't talking about types of emotion or categories of emotion. He was talking about instances, or what philosophers would call tokens. What James was saying was that when you feel angry because someone, blocked your goals, or if you feel angry because you didn't get something you deserved, or if you are angry at your child, or if you're angry for whatever reason, that in each instance where you feel something, that anger feels different, you will have a different bodily state. So when you are, and he actually has beautiful examples of this, but the idea of being afraid of a bear versus being afraid that you'll lose your lover versus being afraid, that each of these fears is an instance that is different from the other. He has this great quote where he says, anger doesn't exist in the entative sense, which means it's not an entity, it's not a thing with an essence.
Yeah, that's.
And so how could it be that, and he goes on and on about how really idiotic it would be to assume that each emotion category has its own pattern when it's so clear that there's all this variability, even within a single category. So how can it be that William James could be quoted as, and not only quoted, but that, decades, almost half a century of science could be dictated by the exact opposite of what he said. He's quoted as saying the exact opposite of what he actually said.
In one context, but in the other context, he is saying that you should have this sort of bodily state that's informing your. So if you already buy the story,
no, but listen. No one's ever saying that your body's doing random things, right? Your body is that each instance has its own physical comportment.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: there was someone at that time who said that each category has its own bodily pattern. That was Carl Lange.
Right.
So
this is where James Lange
the James Lange theory is like a Frankenstein theory.
Yeah.
It's like taking two theories that on the surface look the same, but in the details are saying the opposite thing and putting them together. So anyone who cites the James Lange theory of emotion has not read William James.
Woo! Wow.
And
So-
not only that, I actually go back into the history a little bit and I show who actually made that mistake first and why did they make it and what does it have to do with our deep beliefs about human nature that would allow us to not only make this mistake, but actually perpetuate it in almost a century worth of science.
This makes me a little nervous. You make me a little nervous. I'm a little...
Are you nervous or are you interested and enthusiastic?
Well, I think both, right? And there we go. But isn't the brain and the study of the brain going to save us from all of this stuff? Because once we're able to really look at the functioning brain and get really fine-grained at the level of what's controlling the body. Well, let me even back up a little bit from that. When I think about the diversity of bodily responses, you and I have talked about this before, it's that diversity is probably accounted for by the fact that these different instances of anger don't only have anger per se to do as a thing to do, they have problems to solve in the environment, right? In the environment, these different versions of anger entail different demands on you and your body.
Think about what Obrist said. So this is a great physiologist in the the 60s through the 80s, right? His point, it was an excellent point, was that the physical state of your body corresponds to either what action you are taking or what action you are about to take. So when you shout in anger, when you smile in anger, when you sit quietly and seethe in anger, in each case, your body is doing something different. The physical systems of your body are in a different state because your actions are different.
Right. I think that's such an important thing.
So the question then becomes, how is the brain, in combination with the body, creating these incredibly contextualized, highly variable instances of anger, let's say? How does it do that? And how is it that you as the perceiver are able to identify in other people these highly variable instances, all as anger? That's the real mystery. That's the real question. And what I do in the book is I explain how. How is the brain able to do this? It's not just a brain by itself. It's a brain.
Body.
It's a body, but it's also a brain and a body in the context of other brains and bodies, right?
Right. Of course. I mean, you don't have to tell me. I mean, this is my whole research program. But
Exactly.
It's a brain that's sort of trying to anticipate what's going to happen.
Exactly.
And move in a body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it turns out that if you look at research on anatomy, research on physiology, research on signal processing, electrical signal processing, because neurons actually have an electrical aspect to them.
Yeah.
If you look at all of that evidence, having nothing to do with emotion, just the evidence itself, what you see is that the brain actually is wired to predict, and it is wired to predict the body. And everything else that you do, that you feel, that you see, that you hear, is based on your brain's predictions about what the body needs to do.
Right. And then feedback about how well it's done it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I have to tell you that I'm an inherently skeptical person, as you know. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, right?
Yeah.
So I don't believe anything. I sometimes don't even believe my own data, right? So the thing for me that was so compelling, and I felt like it was okay for me to write this book, was that do we know everything about how the brain predicts? No, absolutely not. Are there still some really interesting and important questions to be answered? Yes, absolutely there is. But the fact that you have all of these different literatures, anatomy, signal processing, physiology, I could go on.
Yeah.
And the fact, brain imaging.
Exercise
and,
physiology.
No, sure, exactly. No, and the thing is that, and you keep coming across these ideas again and again and again. And they don't know each other, these literatures.
And they have different names.
They have different names.
There's free energy. there's, Bayesian brain hypothesis, there's predictive coding. And it goes.
Yeah. And so I was just reading, for example, these really nice papers by a neuroscientist named Danielle Bassett, who's at Penn, at University of Pennsylvania. And she's doing connectomics work. She's a physicist doing connectomics work. So she's studying the connections between neurons in the brain. And her evidence, which she doesn't connect it to prediction, she doesn't do that. But when you read the evidence, you're like, oh my God, this totally fits. And so I was just at a conference a couple of days ago in Pittsburgh. Pete Gianaris and that crew would do fantastic work in health physiology. And sure enough, there's the evidence.
We call it,
So it's very, very, so do we know everything? No. Do we know enough to be able to say the brain is not a reactive organ, it's a predictive organ? Your brain is using past experience to guess at the immediate future, which eventually becomes your present. Do we know that this is really happening? And I think the answer is we do. And the understanding how the brain makes these guesses is the key to understanding how emotions are made, and not just emotions, but really every thought, every memory, every action that you take, every perception that you have. The key is to understanding the brain's predictive dynamics.
And its ability to flexibly solve problems that it perceives in the environment.
The really cool thing about a brain, as you know, is that brains are able to take bits and pieces of past experience and combine them in brand new ways.
Yeah.
In neuroscience, we call this generativity, right? We have generative brains.
Yeah.
So the idea is that our brain is running a generative internal model. It's using the past to predict the immediate future. Does it make one prediction at a time? No, it makes whole populations of predictions at a time. It's making tons of guesses.
Yeah.
And then one of those guesses, or some small number, will be confirmed or corrected by the evidence from the outside world and from your body. Now, here's the really cool thing, which I talk about in my book. What's a concept?
Yeah.
In cognitive science, a concept is a population of representations that are similar for some purpose. So a category is a collection of instances that are similar for some purpose. They don't have to necessarily look the same or smell the same or sound the same. They have to have the same function.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And a concept is a population of those things. So when the brain is generating a population of predictions about impending sensory...
It's creating concepts.
So your brain...
I never thought of it in those terms.
Right. So
that was super helpful for me.
So
thank you.
And because when the brain is anticipating sensory inputs in the next moment so that it tries to guess what to do about them, it's not asking what are these sensations. It's asking what are these sensations like
and
relative to my past experience. And so what it does is it generates concepts on the fly. So when I ask you, what's the concept of a bird, or what's the concept of a bird, you might give me a list of features, right? That's because you're right then. It's not like you're reading off some static representation that you have of a bird. You're generating an instance and you're telling me right? So, but if I say, what are the properties of a bird, and you and I were out in a park, you would say, probably the properties that a robin has, maybe, or a sparrow. But if we
would cue you in that direction.
But if you were hungry and we were in a restaurant and I said, what are the properties of a bird? Yeah. You might say, it
Chicken.
Roasts well.
Right, exactly.
So the idea that your brain is it's using past experience to generate predictions, concepts as guesses about what's going to happen next for the purposes of regulating your body. Because, your brain starts to prepare your body for action before it needs to make those actions. And it's preparing a bunch of actions, and then it's waiting for information from the world and from your own internal body to know which action to take. And your experiences are a consequence of that. So think about it for a minute. In our normal way of thinking about things, we think that there's a stimulus that we experience which causes a reaction. But instead what's happening is, based on the present moment right now, your brain is making a guess about what actions it needs to take next. And based on that, you have perceptions.
Yeah.
So perception follows action. It doesn't precede it.
Because it combines prediction
Right.
and feedback.
Correct.
Yeah.
The stimulus, what we've always called the stimulus, is the feedback.
Yeah.
It's the, right?
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely true. It's tough to keep in mind.
Yeah, but
it's important.
It's tough to keep in mind, but it's super powerful. And I
Yes.
have to tell you that my book so far has done very well.
Good. Congratulations.
But I'm not. Thank you. But I'm not actually saying it to brag. I'm making a point that I get emails almost on, certainly on a weekly basis and sometimes on a daily basis, from people telling me that this book has changed their life.
Really?
The thing that they find really empowering is understanding that they have a predicting brain.
Yeah.
It
Super
explains
important.
to them
Yeah.
not only some of the feelings and thoughts that they have, but they understand that because your brain is predictive, your horizon of control over your own mental life is broadened quite significantly. And in the book, I talk about ways in which this control is broadened and how you can be more effective as an architect of your own experience now that you know how the brain predicts. Does it mean that you can just snap your fingers and change how you feel in an instant? No, you can't. You never can.
Right.
Does it mean that it will be easy for you now to regulate your thoughts or feelings? No, it's never easy, actually. But you do have many more options to architecting your own life than you might have thought. And I think that's the thing that people find powerful. They find it empowering and inspiring enough that they write me emails about it.
You're reminding me again of the sort of the way in which what you're speaking about from a conceptual point of view is generalizable, and that is in evolutionary approaches to talking about emotion or behavior generally. And one of the big influences on me in the last 10 years has been the discovery of behavioral ecology as a field and as an alternative in terms of evolutionary thinking to evolutionary psychology.
So absolutely right. And in this book, I actually also talk about how this view, which I have crafted, first of all, I can't claim it's mine. I'm really, of course, I think I've added some innovations, but
But no
I'm
question,
knitting
you've
together.
been at the center of it for a long time.
I'm knitting together a lot of ideas from a lot of people. But the point is that it's very consistent with evolutionary biology. It's very consistent with actually Darwin's On the Origin of Species. So one of the things I talk about is how, the classical view, basic emotion view, some appraisal views for those listeners who know something about emotion, is the views that are very consistent with Darwin's the experience of the emotions in man and animals are actually inconsistent with On the Origin of Species, because Darwin actually contradicted himself in the two books, right? The view that I've put forward, the theory that I've put forward, and I should say when I say the word theory here, I don't mean the ideas, I mean the ideas that are backed up by tremendous amounts of evidence. I'm using theory in a technical sense. Is very consistent with Darwin's On the Origin of Species. It's specific with a number of conceptual innovations that he introduced in that book that don't appear actually.
Because it's adaptationist.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's selection by consequences.
It's very consistent with behavioral ecology.
Yeah.
And I talk a lot about how this is the case and why the average person should care that this is the case, really.
Because what's probably not going on, and this might get us into the brain a little bit if we have time to do that, but is that we have evolutionarily derived modules that are just waiting for the on button to be pushed.
Right. So
we're much more adaptable than that and flexible than that. And our design is for flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So our design is not only for flexibility, though. It's for sure. That's necessary. But actually, our brains are designed for complexity. And what that means is not just like, wow, this is super complex, right? Complexity is the idea that your brain is a single structure of neurons, right? Can take on a huge number of different states. So it's a huge information-bearing structure. And not only that, but it's information gaining. It's information generating because it can combine the past in elements of the past in novel, generative new ways, right? But absolutely. So I should say too that the idea that your brain is a bunch of mental organs, each of which can be flipped on or off and pass information to each other, like like in a relay race.
Yeah, right.
So you have a stimulus, and that's perception, and then passes information to cognition.
I call it the billiard ball model.
Yeah. Or we call it in my lab, we call it blobology. The idea that that your brain is a bunch of mental organs is false anatomically, and also that kind of a brain is too metabolically expensive.
I would say so.
You just can't.
I would guess so.
I mean, one of the major constraints on
it's
brain
not efficient for sure.
No, exactly. But this is to me was a really cool thing to discover, that one of the major constraints on brain evolution is metabolic efficiency.
God, totally.
Right.
And this is also very ecological. This is because the organism has to manage its resources.
Exactly.
And resources are always flying out the door.
Exactly. So I don't know if you remember this, but a number of years ago, you and I had a conversation about using economics as a model for discussing the brain and the nervous system, right?
Yeah, I do.
That the way to think about it, and this is something I talk about in my book, we have technical terms for these things, right? Like allostasis and so on.
Right, exactly.
But the way that I talk about it now is to say something like this, which I think you'll recognize from our prior discussions, right? That you think about your brain as the financial office of a company. And just like a financial office, just like a company has lots of different branches and it has to kind of balance its expenditures and its revenues, your brain has to do the same thing. So your brain is kind of running a budget for your body, and it's making decisions about what to expend, right?
Yeah.
In order to get revenues.
Yeah.
What do we call that? We call that decision making. We call that motivation. We call that reward.
Completely.
Right? But it's always predictive. And sometimes it's predictive in the instance. Like my brain may predict that if I smile at you right now, that you'll smile back. There's a kind of, I'll get a shot of opioids, or oxytocin, which will help opioids if I'm lucky, and then that will be a revenue. But sometimes our decisions are over longer terms, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're going to make investments now, you're going to expend, right? So you're going to maybe even let your body budget go into the red a little in order to get a bigger payoff later.
Yeah,
and we need certain neurochemicals to do that, right?
Yeah.
Like serotonin. And if we don't have enough, we can't really do it.
Yeah.
And, in economics, they talk about this as temporal discounting.
Yeah.
But this is essentially what the brain is doing. It's always running a budget. And we do allow our budgets to get into the red sometimes.
Sometimes because you have to.
Yeah. But the expectation is that you'll get the revenues correspondingly, because your brain, I always tell my husband this when he, complains I've spent too much money on shoes. I say, my brain is not metabolically frivolous. I am not, I'm frugal. My brain is very frugal. But your brain actually is really frugal. This is the reason why you don't learn everything. You can't predict everything about the current situation, and your brain doesn't learn everything that you haven't predicted, right? So it can't pay attention to everything because that's metabolically frivolous. It's only going to learn the things that it predicts will be relevant for the body budget in the future. Yeah.
One of the most exciting things I discovered when I started reading in the behavioral ecology literature was the idea of the surplus, that biological organisms universally are designed to generate surpluses.
Yeah. Even single-cell organisms.
I know. It's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but correspondingly, when your body budget gets in the red, if it gets too far in the red, or it's been in the red for too long, your brain will start to treat your body like it's sick.
Right.
Your immune system
Right.
gets involved. And then if it goes on for long enough, you actually really will get sick.
Yeah.
This is why, though, that many of the physical symptoms, the physical sensations of illness are similar to the physical sensations of mood disorders, because They are similar at a physical level. They're similar.
Yeah.
Their meaning isn't similar necessarily,
Right.
or it might be. I mean, that's an open question. But the physical properties of the sensations are the same.
So interesting. One of the things that I love about where you've gone with all of this stuff is that I think early on when I was reading your work in the 90s and discussing it with people, there was this sort of idea that you were sort of anti-biology, that you were like, that this sort of social constructivism was kind of a quasi-political view that was sort of a response to the geneticization of things in psychology, or the biologizing of things. And you have proved that. You've laid that to rest. I really like the way, and I think it's been important for you to have dug in so much in with the biology and really respect the true nature of the biology, the brain and the biology and what the biological systems are for.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
How they do that stuff.
I will say this, that there's a stereotype, and I think for a long time, the stereotype was probably reasonable, that the classical view was citing an evolutionary view. I think it's the wrong evolutionary view. It's not Darwin's great innovations in On the Origin of Species, but his more essentialist ideas that are more Lamarckian.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
But nonetheless, they labeled themselves as an evolutionary view. They pointed to, what we now know to be a misunderstanding of William James.
They asserted themselves as the real scientists.
Yeah, as the real scientists. And then construction was always social construction.
It's Foucault and Derrida.
Or psychological construction,
Yeah.
which sort of was seen to ignore biology. And I think what this book does is first of all, it integrates natural constructivism, which is an approach to science, which integrates neuroconstruction, psychological construction, social construction, in a way that shows the biology of meaning making. This book fundamentally is really about the biology and the evolutionary significance of the biology of meaning making. It's about the physiological, biological, not so much genetics. I do talk a little bit about genetics, but the book is already 400 pages.
Can't do it all.
You can't do it all. But that is actually, I have a lot to say about genetics. It's just my editor was like, enough already, enough. About the biological architecture that allows the brain to construct, and not just construct immediate experiences or direct actions, but also what is the biology of social construction? What happens to a little infant brain? A little infant brain is not a miniature adult brain. It's a little brain that's born waiting for wiring instructions, waiting for wiring instructions on how to wire itself to its social, to its physical and its social circumstances. And so what does that mean, actually, the biology of that? What does that mean for making comments about cultural variation, or understanding how all of the phenomena that social constructivists, not all of it, but some of it, might be understood in biological terms? So I will tell you that some of my most gratifying moments with this book are when sociologists or anthropologists come up to me and say, you've just outlined the first plausible biological framework for understanding how construction works. And my most frustrating moments are when, like on Amazon, for example, most of the reviews are very positive, but there are a couple, like 1 or 2 star reviews, and these folks say, oh, this is just another, social construction book. And I'm thinking, these people haven't read past the introduction, I think, because there are several chapters plus an appendix, several appendices, 900 plus endnotes, and then almost 1,000 web notes about the biology that undergirds any constructivist approach.
Well, I tell you, I feel so lucky that somewhere in like 2000, maybe it's 1999 even, when I can't remember when I first met you. It was at a conference.
Yeah, right. That's right. In Arizona.
And we were both, what I discovered, I couldn't believe it, because I had grown up in this completely different set of assumptions about what emotion was and about the physiology of emotion and the neuroscience of emotion. And I saw you as being in this utterly different camp. And I remember discovering at that conference that we thought very similarly about things, and also learning that you were really thinking hard about measurement and measurement models and the assumptions under different measurement models. And having that moment, this is part of why I'm doing these, because I had this moment where we talked. I remember we sat down, we had to go to another room because we were really talking a lot about what I would later call the emergent variable model, what Bolin and Lennox and you called it the effects model. I have to make it more concrete somehow. I can't deal with abstract terms.
Well, we've been trying to figure out how to do that, you and I and other people, for I don't know, since we talked about it all those years ago,
right?
Almost 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah, but what a generative, exciting conversation. Yeah. And that's when I really started, it was like a walking around and seeing your work from a different perspective, and then pulling on the thread little by little, reading more and more of it, and thinking, oh yeah, I got to read this stuff. I got to know this stuff. And also realizing that I had the training and the materials to see what you were talking about already. I just had a worldview that was keeping it sort of blurry and out of view.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that. First of all, I'm smiling as you're talking because I remember that. I remember very vividly that set of interactions. And then when we reconnected a number of years later, when I came to Virginia to give a talk, and so a meeting of the minds is so satisfying in science, particularly when you're talking to someone, on the other side of some debate, right? That you feel like you've achieved some mutual understanding. So it's very gratifying.
Yeah.
But, one of the things I talk about in the book is thinking about why it is that the evidence has been there all along that the classical view is seriously in doubt, but we've really clung to it. So in every era where people have written about this classical view, there's always been evidence, whatever counted as evidence in that era,
right.
that the view is wrong, but yet the view has persisted across thousands of years. This is not hyperbole. This is, actual fact from the written record. Why would it be the case? And I think the answer is that the classical view is a theory of human nature. It's a particular theory of human nature that we get from ancient Greece that we've tattooed onto the brain, MacLean's triune brain, which we know to be, evolutionary biologists have known for 100 years that view is false, but yet it still persists in almost...
It's even Platonic. It's like...
Oh, but it exists, and it lurks in all of psychological theory. The idea that... cognition regulates emotion, the idea that we have system 1 and system 2, the idea that we have an ego and an id, the idea that we have any dual process theory of any sort in psychology is also a remnant of this particular view of human nature. And it's a view of human nature which is, really culturally bound and not supported by the architecture of the nervous system. So... And I talk a lot about this in particular chapters in the book because I think it's important not just for understanding emotion, but it's important for understanding the law, that it's embedded in our view of the law. It's embedded in our view of illness and treatment for illness, physical versus mental illness. The idea that your mind derives from your body is not a mystical statement. It is a biologically verifiable statement. You can actually point to the systems that where the mind is constituted out of, not solely, but partially, information from the body.
Yeah.
But our particular Western view of human nature is really limited, how we do science of the mind and also our application of that science. And so one of the things that I take on in the book, particularly in the final chapter, is instead of starting with mental categories that were bestowed to us by the ancient Greeks and asking where do we find these in the brain? So where does attention live in the brain? Where does memory live in the brain? Where does anger live in the brain? Let's start with the structure and function of the nervous system and ask, what kind of human minds can a structure like this make?
Interesting.
And maybe our theory of human nature should be adjusted instead of being the driver.
Lisa Feldman Barrett, thank you so much for talking with me. This was fabulous.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
All right. Okay, that's it. I am feeling really lucky right now that I get to do stuff like that. Just want everyone to know that my luck has not gone unnoticed. Thanks to my friend Lisa Feldman Barrett for taking a little time out of her very busy schedule to just talk with me, and for maintaining that laser focus that she does on the topic of emotion. Whew, that was something. Folks, you might be thinking at this point, well, my mind is blown and I want to learn more about this stuff or something like that. So I'm going to mention Lisa's book one more time before we close. It's called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain, and it's from Houghton Mifflin. Houghton Mifflin. I think it's Houghton Mifflin Press. I don't really know how to pronounce that. But anyway, it's already out there in bookstores all over the place. So go get it, okay? And I also want to say the music on Circle of Willis is written by Tom Stouffer and Gene Woolley and performed by their band The New Drakes. For information on how to purchase their music, check out the About page at circleofwillis.com. And don't forget that Circle of Willis is brought to you by VQR and the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. And that Circle of Willis is a member of the Teej FM network. You can find out more about that, if you want, at teej.fm. Also, if you like this podcast, how about giving us a little review at iTunes and letting us know how we're doing? It is very easy, super easy, and we like it. Or you can send us an email by going to circleofwillispodcast.com and clicking on the Contact tab. In any case, I'll see you all at episode 6, where I talk with social neuroscientist demigod John Cassiopo of the University of Chicago about just about everything, including how science ought to be done and why it's so important to have friends. Until then, bye-bye.
Down in deep and haul my ageless roam, and all my grace is sound asleep, and all my faith is gone. There was nothing to stop me from chasing down the spiral. Nothing to stop me from wasting